So on one hand, it's, let's say, one of the areas we have more information about than we have about many other places on the map of Alaska. But at the same time, as I think, most recent archaeological work involving excavation took place almost 40 years ago now. Kachemak Bay has a very interesting prehistoric past. It now seems clear that people of several different cultural traditions have been living there for at least 3,000 years. I don't find it all unlikely in my own mind that further work will push them back several thousand years further into the past. In terms of the kind of touchy questions Professor Morgan was raising this morning, the hows and the so whats of study, as well as the fun of trying to find out what did happen. Kachemak Bay, I think, offers a very, and the immediately adjacent area, I might add, offers some very interesting problems from an anthropological point of view. Many of you are probably aware that at the time of the coming of Europeans, much of Kachemak Bay was occupied by a branch of the Tenaina Athabascan speakers, who were doing some very atypical things from the point of view of what you conceive Athabascans ought to be doing, such as hunting sea mammals and fishing for halibut in skin boats, using harpoons, throwing boards, and other devices that we think of more typically associated with Eskimo people. This is the only place in, well, all of Alaska and the world, as far as I know, where men of Athabascan speech came down to salt water and perfected, in some fashion, a maritime adaptation. Thanks to De Laguna's work, which was done quite some years ago, we know that for probably now several thousand years, Kachemak Bay was the domain of a succession of cultures that were not most likely Athabascan in linguistic or biological sense. That should take much more explanation, but I'll just toss it off here since I can get away with things in a short talk. I couldn't get away with a longer one. But seem rather very, very closely related, almost to the point of identity, with similar occupations on Kodiak Island during the same span of time. So you have a very interesting situation in the Kachemak Bay area in the southern Kenai Peninsula. At what point in time was this earlier Eskimo adaptation replaced, sea mammal hunting adaptation replaced by Tenaina, and why did this happen? What mechanism can we visualize that would have the effect of bringing about this replacement population? I raise these questions as well worth looking into. I don't make any promise whatsoever that I'm going to answer them this afternoon. We need a much more fine-grained understanding than we now have of environmental change and other possibilities. One thing I find most unlikely is that Tenaina, ancestral Tenaina, who presumably were an inland people, as are most people of Athabascan speech, came down and somehow unceremoniously evicted or threw out preceding Eskimo population that had been doing something right over a span of perhaps several thousand years. It remains a basic problem. There's not a tremendous amount of hard information right now bearing on the antiquity of the Tenaina, essentially, in Kachemak Bay. From an inventory of the described Tenaina material culture, we realize we find in there many tools, implements, and that sort of thing that likely are of Eskimo inspiration, indicating contact with Eskimo technologies, and that's using the term very, very sloppily. Archaeology, so far, hasn't contributed nearly as much as it should. De Laguna, 40 years ago, did encounter a series of sites in Kachemak Bay and the vicinity characterized by sharp rectangular house pits, often the presence of thin shell middens, presence of European trade goods, which quite likely can confidently be referred to Tenaina. At what point in time Kachemak Bay archaeology becomes ancestral Tenaina archaeology is, I think, still a very real question. There's one tradition, and I won't presume to evaluate its reliability. One Tenaina informant at one time, anyways, said, for the record, that the Tenaina people had come down from the Caribou Hills and had come down actually somewhere in the vicinity of Cottonwood Creek. As I say, I don't presume to evaluate the reliability of that. Anyways, this is a sort of a background or framework which will bring us around to the main part of our presentation, which is going to be running through a series of slides showing our efforts this last summer at the site of Cottonwood, which is located about 11 miles up bay on the Homer side, not far from Yule Kilcher's place, if that does some things for people here, and a week's testing operation at another site called Indian Island or Chugachik on the maps. And in a moment we'll get around to the slides. I might attempt to explain why we settled on an excavation of Cottonwood Creek. And as usually is the case when you look in detail at what people do, it's a mixture of pure and impure motives, which I mean ones that have valid scientific reference and some of them that are dictated more by necessity or other conditions. Okay, I'd had previous experience on Kodiak Island for 3 or 4 summers, realized that Kachemak Bay material through De Laguna's publication was very closely related to what we had found on Kodiak. So I wouldn't have had to learn an entire new alphabet. I was bound and determined after spending a couple of years getting rid of a dissertation that this summer I was going back to the field. I was going to run the Alaska Methodist University Summer Field Program in cooperation with the University of Alaska in Anchorage. In order to do that economically, since there's not a tremendous amount of funding for this, I had to find some place that was logistically feasible. Preferably you could get into with a minimum amount of boat charter, airplaning, and other expensive things. And so those are some of the impure motives. Cottonwood Creek filled the bill in this regard. It was accessible. It was an area that, for reasons that escape me entirely, has not been systematically worked in the sense of an excavation for 40 years, and right on the doorstep of people lucky enough to live in Anchorage. The fact that Homer is in the Kachemak Bay area is also beautiful, I won't say was a negative factor in this selection. More aesthetically interesting justifications are the fact that on the basis of previous work we knew there was both a late Pacific Eskimo occupation here, by which I mean probably terminating somewhere around the year 1000 on the basis of our present understanding, and a Tenaina or thin veneer of later yet occupation whose ethnic identity can't really be spelled out. It occurred to me that careful analysis of the shell foo of fish and other remains from the midden itself might throw some light on something that's obviously happened. Cottonwood is an enormous shell midden, reaching a depth of 10 to 12 feet in places. It contains many kinds of shells and quantities of shells you just aren't going to find anywhere in that area today. I think in the long run, perhaps, we'll be able to spot some significant environmental changes, at least on a local level. There is this tantalizing historical suggestion that the Cottonwood Creek area was occupied as early as any other place by ancestral Tenaina. That I would never presume to document archaeologically. You will never find the first of anything. And to be sure, that is what you have. There was also a number of gaps to be filled in the record, as worked out in very admirable skeleton form by De Laguna long ago. For example, we need a series of radiocarbon dates in order to tie in the chronology more precisely with what we've learned from other areas. So we had a variety of motives. There was also present at the Cottonwood Creek site a cabin, we'll see that on the picture here, that was being utilized in the late 1920s by Tenaina for trapping purposes in the winter of the year. We have pictures of what it looked like in the 1920s. It was built in something in old style, the planks running up and down and a supplementary room on the side. It's now a complete ruin. It would be an interesting project to excavate at least part of that for reasons I'll try and explain as we get to the slides, which I guess we had better do.
All of the slide portions of the conference have been omitted due to the inability to properly illustrate the slides over audio tape.
That's it. Okay. We'll be back in about 15 minutes. Let's have a coffee break with the Tenaina language. Tenaina language, Dr. James Carey has been working on this language along with Peter Kalafonsky, Fedosia Sakaloff, and others for about 2 years, I guess. And they have developed a writing system for the language. This once dying language now can be considered to be preserved, mainly by the efforts of these people here. Dr. Carey.
Thank you, Ron. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here today with two of my teachers. I first started my work here in Kenai very briefly in the spring of '72, and at that time, you can't hear us? At that time, how's that? At that time, I came up with my wife, and we camped in the area and met people. And at that time, I met Peter Kalafonsky and Fedosia Sakaloff and Bertha Munford and the late F.M. Baktuit. And I did linguistic work with them for about 2 weeks. And then I was able to return in the fall of '73, well, in September of '73. And we've lived here in the area continuously since then. Like I said, it's a pleasure for me to appear with my teachers. One of them couldn't be here today. That's Mrs. Bertha Munford. We're very sorry she couldn't be with us. She wanted to be here. Her thoughts are with you. But we were happy to know that she just got back from the hospital and is recovering nicely from an operation that she just had. I can't really begin to say enough about my teachers and how good they are for the kind of work that we've done and how patient and helpful and dedicated they've been to the work that we've been doing. I'm going to talk a little bit more through the course of this presentation about their specific ways they've helped and the kind of skills that they have for this kind of language work. Today I'm going to, what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a background on some of the research, the linguistic research that we have done, and then I'm going to talk about the practical work, the work that has to do with school programs and the teaching of the language. And through the course of the presentation, Fedosia is going to say some verbs for you. The Tenaina language has one of the most complicated verb systems of any language in the world, and we're going to show you a little bit of the complexity of that. She's going to explain or say some forms for you, and I'm going to write them down for you. And then later on in the presentation, Peter is going to read a story that he just wrote last week that I think you'll find interesting. I'd like you to ask questions as we go along. I tend to go fast and get absorbed in details, and sometimes it doesn't make for the best listening, and I'd like you to stop and slow me down and ask questions of either me or my two teachers here. And so please feel free to stop us and raise your hands. Okay, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about what we call Tenaina, or what's generally known as the Tenaina language, or Denaina. And I want to point some things out on the map. Well, before I turn the blackboard around, the name Tenaina that is in the anthropological literature is based on this word Denaina, and that's their name for people, or native people, which Morgan Sherwood referred to this morning in some of his research. It's a typical Athabascan word for people, and that's what the name Tenaina comes from. Let me turn this around. Can you hear me all right when I just stand here without a microphone? Can you hear me? No? Maybe that one detaches here and I can hold it. Kenai is an Athabascan language, and Athabascan is a family of about 50 languages. Athabascan is a family of about 50 languages. It's the most widespread language family in North America. What I mean by a family of languages is the same thing like we mean when we say Indo-European is a family of languages. That means that like Sanskrit and German are related languages at one time, historically. Athabascan is such a family of languages, and the Navajos and the Apaches in New Mexico speak a language that is very close, very similar to the language that these people speak here in Kenai. There's about 7 or 8 Athabascan languages in the southwestern part of the United States. In Oregon and California, there formerly were about 15 Athabascan languages. That's in Northern California, in Humboldt County, and slightly south of Humboldt County, and then on the coast of Oregon. Right now, there's probably about 5 or 6 people who still speak some of the, no, wait a minute now, I just lopped off 20. There's about 25 people who speak some of the Athabascan languages of California and Oregon, the most numerous of whom are the Hupa people. There's about 20 people who speak the Hupa language, and then there's about 5 people who speak a couple of the other Oregon Athabascan languages. And then all in northern Canada, in the Northwest Territories, through the northern half of British Columbia, northern half of Alberta, and into Saskatchewan, people, and in the Yukon, the native languages of the area are Athabascan. And then in the interior of Alaska, languages are Athabascan. Athabascan is a very conservative, very homogeneous language family. All the languages are very similar, and they're very obviously related. They're very closely related languages, and they have a reputation for complexity, a notorious reputation for complexity, which is the main reason why I like to study them. They're a lot of fun. Now, let me talk a little bit about where the Dena'ina language is, and also a little bit about the Alaska Native Language Map and the neighbors of the Dena'ina people. Right now, there are about 200 speakers of the Dena'ina language. The language formerly was in Seldovia. Well, there are 2 people in Seldovia who are marginal speakers of the language, but there's no real good speaker of the Seldovia dialect except possibly one woman who lives in Seattle. And then on this side of the Kenai Peninsula in Kenai, and formerly whatever the village makeup was on this side of the villages was all Kenai territory. And then up behind Anchorage, up is probably around Talkeetna area, and up the Susitna River was the boundary up this way, and then up toward in the Matanuska Valley, probably in the Palmer area, but not as far as Eska Creek. Eska Creek and further inland from there seems to be the Atna language. There's a language boundary there in the Matanuska Valley, and then in coming on this side of the inlet, that includes Eklutna and Kinnick and Susitna, formerly when Susitna was an inhabited village, all Tenina speaking. And then I don't really know what the village makeup was up above there, but there's some Tenina speakers, presumably from the Talkeetna area. And then Tyonek and formerly Kuskotan, which in the old Tenina village. And then down on the shore of Cook Inlet here, down as far as Iliamna Bay, presumably. And then up here on Iliamna Lake, there were a number of villages. Pedro Bay is where the main home is of the Tenina people, the Naina people who still live on the lake. And then in Dalton is a Denaina village. And then Lime Village, which is up on the upper Stony River, where over here is another Denaina village. So you would draw the map the language map for the people like this. Like that. And by the way, there is a new map of Alaska Native languages that's coming out from the Alaska Native Language Center in Fairbanks, and which has the linguistic boundaries drawn on them. Now, how do we say this is a language and that Atna over here is a separate language, and in Gallic over here on this side is a separate language? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, the language boundary would run from Seldovia up above Anchorage to roughly around Talkeetna, and then at some point like this, cutting back toward the upper Stony River where Lime Village is, and then down through this northern half of Lake Iliamna. What we mean by saying that that is a language is that can be defined by certain properties. You can just count certain traits that they have in common and see the common patterns in the grammar of the language and in the vocabulary of the language that the other languages to them, neighboring them, just don't share. And then those languages in themselves form a cluster of dialects and share their own separate traits for those same things. The language to the west is they call in Gallic in this area, in the Kuskokwim and part of the lower Yukon River. And then the language in this area from Cantwell and then down Copper River, and then, like I said, and then down as far east as Mentasta, and then down toward Chitna, and then down toward the Matanuska Valley is what they call Atna, the Copper River people, the Atna language. There are about 10 Athabascan languages in Alaska. That includes some of the people up here in this area. Well, you've probably seen the maps before of the linguistic boundaries. They run something like this for Athabascan territory. And then within that area, there are 10 different languages. Yeah. Well, I'm calling them different languages, and then within those languages there are dialects. Within the Tenaina language, I come to mention, there are 3 main dialects. And so these are language boundaries. They're a family of languages. Athabascan, this would be like comparing something like, say, many of them are much further apart than, say, Spanish and French. Like the difference between Tenaina and Cochin is more like, say, the difference between Spanish and English. It's a major, the people cannot understand each other. And generally the boundaries are drawn on intelligibility, whether people can understand each other across the boundaries. And I've done some research on the boundaries here between Atna and Tenaina and between Ingalic and Tenaina, studying those questions of intelligibility across the language boundaries. And we really call these separate languages. And then within the languages we have dialects. The interesting thing about Athabascan languages in Alaska is every village had its own way of speaking, and they're very remarkable localization of the languages. It's very remarkable. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that when I talk about some of the dialect work that we've done. Now, on the numbers of speakers, in Seldovia, I said there's 2 marginal speakers and maybe 1 or 2 others. In Kenai, we have 4 good speakers and maybe another 10 or 12 people who understand quite a bit of the language. You could call them marginal speakers. There are another 8 or 10 people who speak the Kenai dialect who live in Anchorage or Tyonek. In Eklutna and in the upper inlet area, there are 7 speakers. In Tyonek, there are around 25 speakers, maybe a few more than that. In Pedro Bay, there are 12 speakers. In Dalton, there are 60 or more speakers, maybe 60 to 70 speakers. In Lime Village, there are about almost 30 speakers. Now, the ages of the speakers is sort of like this. The two marginal speakers in Seldovia are age 52 and 62, and I think the last really expert Seldovia Dena'ina speakers died in the mid-50s. In Kenai, the speakers are over the age of 53. In Eklutna, there are a few speakers in their 50s. I don't know if there's anybody in their 40s who speaks the language. In Tyonek, there are some speakers in their 40s, but they aren't really too good speakers. The good speakers in Tyonek are over the age of 50. In Pedro Bay, the youngest good speaker is 48 years old. In Dalton, the language is more strongly preserved, and there are some speakers as young as 25 years old. And in Lime Village, I'm happy to report there are some children who speak the language, and I just determined that a little earlier this fall when I went over there, and I'm very, very happy about that. There's some kids, there's one boy, he's about 12 years old, and he can really speak very well. He can speak the language well. And there's kids there, most of the school kids can understand the language, but they are dominant in English. They're better speakers of English than of Dena'ina. And, but that is the stronghold of the Dena'ina language, is Lime Village, population 38. And those kids there are the only children in the world who know this language right now. Like I said, the language has a reputation for being very complicated, and one of the things that indicates this is the fact that hardly anyone ever learns it beyond childhood. In fact, it's almost, I don't know if it has been learned beyond someone having grown up in the language. The two areas where they were in contact with Eskimo languages, and I didn't point that out on the map, but English Bay, Port Graham area, the people speak Chugach Eskimo or Suskatoon Aleut, they call that language, and that's an Eskimo language. And then the other area where they came in contact with speakers of another language was in Lake Iliamna area, and in the southern and western parts of Lake Iliamna. Now, in both of those areas, Athabascan speakers would learn the Eskimo language, like in an intermarriage or something like that, but never was the reverse true. Almost never, or even never. I don't know of any cases where the Eskimo speakers learned Athabascan, and that's a very interesting fact. Oh yeah, I neglected to mention that there are 5 Tenina speakers in Stony River, too. You know where the village of Stony River is on the Kuskokwim. And that's a very interesting community. That's a quadrilingual community with 2 Athabascan languages spoken there by about 8 people. And 8 people speak 2 Athabascan languages. And then Eskimo is the dominant native language. Yupik Eskimo is the dominant native language of the community. And then English, of course, is now the first language of the children. And in that community, it's very interesting with all the, the mix of languages. The same pattern holds true too. The Athabascans learn Eskimo. For example, one woman I'm thinking of was married to an Eskimo. She speaks fluent Eskimo. Her kids learn Eskimo, and they don't learn Athabascan. And then in other cases of intermarriage, or for example, her husband did not learn Athabascan. And this seems to be the pattern throughout the state when Athabascan and Eskimo came in contact. And I think it also, it very clearly reflects the very difficulty of learning the language, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes when Fedosia says some verbs for you. Also, another thing that I think indicates the difficulty of the language is the lack of Russian liturgical materials in the Russian Orthodox Church that were translated into the language. There's nothing that we can find that they did, songs or prayers or things that were translated. Maybe something will turn up, but we have no record of this as opposed to the some quite extensive work that was done in Aleut and Yupik Eskimo and Chugach Eskimo, and in Tlingit too, which is also a complicated language. But there's a lack of religious materials in this language, even though the church was here for a long time.